The Industrial Age Kids, 1800s. Before social media or even electricity, kids in the 1800s were born straight into the Industrial Revolution. Childhood didn't look like toys and playgrounds. Instead, it looked like coal dust and factory bells. Many children worked 12-hour shifts in textile mills, squeezing between dangerous machines because their small bodies could fit where adults couldn't. If they weren't in factories, they were down in mines, carrying buckets heavier than themselves. If you thought school was the priority, then you would be wrong. Work was. Imagine being 7 years old and your biggest skill was repairing a machine before it crushed your hand. That was life for millions of kids across Europe and America. Laws protecting children were almost non-existent. So for business owners, child labor was cheap, efficient, and easy to replace. But it wasn't all iron and smoke. These kids also lived through inventions that reshaped the world: steam engines, railroads, and the first telegraphs. If you were lucky enough to escape the factory floor, you might see your town transform from a sleepy village to a crowded industrial city in just a few years. The Lost Generation, 1883 to 1900. Being born in the late 1800s meant your teenage years lined up with the nightmare of World War I. By the time you turned 17, you weren't worried about exams as much as you were ducking shells in the trenches, caked in mud, waiting for the next whistle that meant climb the ladder and probably die. The numbers speak for themselves. Around 8.5 million soldiers were killed, and another 21 million came home injured, many missing limbs or blinded by gas. Even those who survived weren't spared. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 spread through barracks and towns, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide. For many in this generation, the war ended and then the flu picked up where the artillery left off. And just when the world should have been rebuilding, the 1920s crashed into the Great Depression. Jobs disappeared, banks collapsed, and food lines stretched across cities. No wonder writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, themselves members of this generation, wrote about disillusionment. The Lost label wasn't about wandering home drunk from a bar. It meant that after war, plague, and poverty, millions of young people felt stripped of direction. Their entire youth had been chewed up by disasters on a scale humanity had never seen before. The Greatest Generation, 1901 to 1927. Kids born in the early 1900s grew up in a world that didn't stay steady for long. One decade you might be running around in dusty small towns or crowded city streets, and the next your family is lining up outside a soup kitchen. The stock market collapse in 1929 hit like a hammer. Banks failed, jobs vanished, and in the US alone, 1 out of every 4 workers was unemployed. Families lost their homes, kids quit school to help out, and every meal felt like it might be the last good one for a while. Just as people were adjusting to that misery, another disaster arrived: World War II. Whole countries became battlefields. Young men barely out of high school were sent overseas, while their families rationed food, rubber, and gasoline at home. Over 60 million people were killed worldwide, and the Holocaust added a new depth of horror, with 6 million Jews murdered. For this generation, the 1930s and 40s meant survival first, dream second. When the war was over, there wasn't some big sigh of relief. People stepped off trains to find their towns in ruins, their savings gone, and their families scraping by on whatever they could find. It was less welcome home and more grab a shovel, we've got work to do. That's how you get the birth of the United Nations, new economic systems, and a wave of innovation that shaped the rest of the century. People like Alan Turing, who cracked Nazi codes and laid the groundwork for modern computers, or Grace Hopper, who turned coding into something people could actually use. This was a generation that had stared into chaos and decided to build anyway. The Silent Generation, 1928 to 1945. Being born between the Great Depression and World War II meant childhood was more about ration cards than recess. Families pinched every penny, patched clothes until they fell apart, and treated wastefulness like a crime. Kids grew up fast because there wasn't much choice. If you didn't help out, your household might not make it through the week. This generation learned discipline the hard way. While modern kids complain about walking to school, these were the kids trudging miles through rain or snow, then coming home to split firewood or stand in line for flour. Complaining had no payoff. Adults were too busy keeping food on the table to care about grumbling, so kids learned early to keep quiet and keep moving. They were called the silent generation because they kept their heads down and got on with life. Survival came first, talking came later. By the 1940s, a lot of them were teenagers trying to grow up in a world that hadn't settled down yet. Cities were still scarred from bombings, ration books were part of daily life, and nobody knew what the future would look like. In times like that, stability meant everything. People leaned on discipline, modesty, and keeping their heads down, knowing chaos could come back at any moment. Kind of like trying not to jinx yourself after finally fixing the leaky roof. Humor wasn't lost on them though, it just showed up differently. While today's generations post avocado toast on Instagram, someone from the silent era would have looked at that plate and said, toast alone would have been a luxury. Out of that environment came some of the strictest work ethics in history. The silent generation built families, businesses, and communities on sacrifice and self-control. They weren't flashy, but they laid the foundation for the modern middle class. Baby Boomers, 1946 to 1964. After World War II, soldiers came home and decided the best way to celebrate survival was to start families. Lots and lots of them. Between 1946 and 1964, birth rates exploded. Hospitals were packed, nurseries overflowed. They got the name Baby Boomers because so many kids were born after the war. In the US alone, more than 76 million babies showed up, making it the biggest generation the country had ever seen. Growing up in this era felt different. The economy was climbing, suburbs were spreading, and for the first time in decades, optimism was the background music of daily life. A house with a white picket fence, 2 kids, and maybe even a car in the driveway. For many families, that became the standard. Basically, if you didn't have a lawn to mow on Saturday, you were doing something wrong. Culture was changing fast. Rock and roll showed up, and Elvis Presley had parents clutching their pearls while teens tried to copy his dance moves. TV became the new family hangout spot, with shows like Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy playing every night. For kids, life wasn't just chores and rules anymore, it finally had some fun, even if that fun meant sneaking around to watch Elvis shake his hips on TV without your dad turning it off. Of course, it wasn't all comfort and white fences. This was also the generation that filled the streets with protests. Boomers marched against the Vietnam War, stood up for civil rights, and pushed women's liberation into the spotlight. Growing up with stability gave them the chance to fight for bigger ideals, and a lot of them took it. Generation X, 1965 to 1980. Generation X sounds like a superhero squad, but instead of powers, they got stuck with high divorce rates and being left home alone after school. That's why they were called the latchkey kids. Parents were busy working, so kids came home, unlocked the door themselves, and learned early how to microwave dinner without burning the house down. Their childhood was full of new gadgets and culture. MTV hit the screen blasting music videos all day, Star Wars became a worldwide obsession, and arcades filled up with kids feeding quarters into machines like Pac-Man. At the same time, the Cold War made people think nuclear war could start any second, so growing up meant bouncing between pop culture highs and global paranoia. Gen X also built a reputation for independence. They didn't expect someone else to solve their problems, because most of the time no one did. When they entered the workforce in the late 70s and 80s, the economy wasn't exactly welcoming. Jobs were a bit shaky, money was more tight, and they had to adapt to survive. Still, this generation shaped the future in some big ways. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Jeff Bezos all came straight out of Gen X, proving that latchkey kids could grow up to run the world's biggest tech companies. They were the first to balance hard work with the idea of having a life, which is how we got things like Casual Fridays. In short, Gen X became the cool older siblings of history, the ones who knew life before smartphones, but also knew how to explain memes to their parents. Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Millennials, also called Generation Y, grew up right as the world was going digital. They remember landline phones and floppy disks, but they also learned to text and post selfies before anyone else. One day you were waiting for dial-up internet to connect, and the next you had a smartphone in your pocket. If adaptability was a skill, millennials had it drilled into them from childhood. Education was a big focus for this generation. Parents pushed college as the key to success, and many went only to graduate into the Great Recession. Imagine finally getting your degree and the job market looks like a tumbleweed rolling by. With student loans piling up, millennials quickly got labeled as lazy or entitled, when in reality, they were just broke. They also flipped the script on what success looks like. Instead of chasing houses with big lawns, many preferred travel, experiences, and side hustles. That's why older generations say millennials killed things like the housing market or chain restaurants. Truth is, those things were already out of reach. You can't buy a house if you're still paying off loans the size of a small country's budget. Culturally, they were the first internet natives. They grew up with MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, and eventually Instagram. They turned memes into a second language and built careers on platforms their parents still struggled to log into. Millennials are often called the in-between generation, like old enough to remember payphones, young enough to master TikTok. Generation Z, 1997 to 2012. Gen Z grew up in a world where Wi-Fi was already everywhere, and phones were basically glued to their hands from day one. Hand them a rotary phone and they'll stare at it like it's a museum piece. For them, Google has always been around. TikTok is as normal as television once was, and memes are basically a second language. If you're part of Gen Z, technology has always been in your life. You didn't have to learn it since it was already there from the start. Many kids in this generation could swipe a tablet before they learned how to write their own name. Social media became the background noise of growing up, with TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat shaping how they talk, joke, and even see the world. But it's not all jokes and dance trends. Gen Z also carries a serious streak. They grew up hearing about climate change, school shootings, and mental health struggles. That mix made them socially aware in a way earlier generations weren't at their age. You'll see teenagers today leading climate marches or running entire businesses from their bedrooms. Their ability to multitask is actually quite impressive. They can do homework, stream on Twitch, and argue in 3 different group chats at the same time. Some call it short attention spans, others call it efficiency. Either way, they're wired to process information at lightning speed. Generation Alpha, 2013 to 2025. Gen Alpha is the first generation born fully in the 21st century. If you're part of this group, you've never known a world without smartphones, streaming, or smart speakers answering questions for you. Their toys talk back, their games are connected to the internet, and classrooms are filled with tablets instead of chalkboards. Some of these kids can work an iPad before they can tie their shoes. For them, asking Siri or Alexa for homework help is normal, and YouTube feels like a better teacher than the one in front of the class. Because of this, Gen Alpha is expected to be even more tech-savvy and socially aware than Gen Z. They're growing up in a time where climate change, artificial intelligence, and global issues are everyday topics. It's shaping them into a generation that knows how to use technology, not just for fun, but also to solve problems. Of course, there's humor in how advanced they are. Parents still trying to figure out how to use the TV remote are raising kids who could probably hack into the smart fridge. First words used to be mama or dada. Now it's starting to sound more like, hey Siri. Gen Alpha is still young, but they're already showing signs of becoming the AI-assisted, VR-using, problem-solving kids who will redefine what growing up looks like in the digital age. The future generation, post-2025. Kids born after Gen Alpha will grow up in a world that feels more like science fiction than real life today. For this generation, traffic jams might mean flying cars waiting for drone delivery lanes to clear. Kids asking, "Are we there yet?" could be doing it while zipping over skyscrapers instead of sitting in the back seat of a minivan. Technology won't just sit in your pocket, instead it might live in your head, literally. With brain-computer links being tested, schools could one day offer download days, where kids load up an entire subject in minutes. Forget cramming for a history test, you might wake up knowing it. Of course, daydreaming could get awkward if your thoughts accidentally pop up on a classroom screen. Daily life will also stretch beyond Earth. Space travel is moving fast, and future kids might treat Mars like just another place on the map. Long-distance relationships could mean dating someone who literally lives on another planet. Vacations might switch from beach trips to zero-gravity hotels. This generation will inherit tools we can barely imagine now, and with them, brand new problems. Privacy, identity, and even what it means to be human could all get redefined. But if history shows anything, kids adapt fast, and sometimes faster than the adults raising them.